panel, which flags of MOSAIC JNU, is entitled Feminist Perspectives on Home, Work and the Law. So I think it would make sense for me to begin to ask our panelists what each of them think is, or maybe particularly their feminist perspective on these issues, on work, home and law. Is it all only about focusing on women? So each of them will get a little time to speak here. Is it all and only about focusing on women and the problems they face at home, at work, and in the legal system? What special ingredients does a feminist perspective bring to understanding and working in your respective fields? So maybe for you, well, basically everything, but politics, etc. Jayati, if you could speak about the economy, and Vrinda about the criminal justice system. So Jayati, would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for that amazing, overstated introduction. And I don't know how much of our time you have taken up in this. But so now we'll keep it short. So yes, what I do want to say is that the critical thing about work is that most economists don't understand it. They don't actually they haven't even recognized the correct definition of it. So, and that means therefore the statistical systems don't recognize it. Just to give you an example, in India we're saying the work participation rate of women is 18%, whereas we all know that most women work, right? And if, in fact, that survey, if you go and look at the details, they say, oh, there are these codes 91 and 92, engaged in household duties. And engaged in household duties plus, which is everything from collecting water and firewood to kitchen gardening to teaching children to you name it, all of that. But they are not workers. They're just there at home. So this failure to recognize unpaid work, which is it's very strong in India, but it is widespread across the economics profession, is absolutely crucial because it allows all our economic analysis, not just looking at employment, it allows all of it to pretend that this entire substratum doesn't exist. That there's this huge amount. I mean, if you actually you add up all the work that women do in India, 86% of women are actively working. And in fact, more women work than men. But we can ignore all of that because we have actually ensured that this unrecognized, unremunerated work becomes the substratum that you can just allow to happen. Now, we used to think of all this as gender blind. It's not gender blind. It's gender exploitative. It's not that they don't know. They know fully well because economic policy and capitalism and employers rely on this. They actually depend on this unpaid work, which we call social reproduction, whatever, but they depend on it because they can cut down on basic social spending, knowing that someone else is going to do the burden. They can do all kinds of other things, assuming that, okay, the market will not allow you access to this care, but someone at the home will deliver it for you. And essentially, this ability to use unpaid work is absolutely critical in understanding the dynamics of any economy and global capitalism. So we ignore it at our peril. It's not just about women. It's very much about how that system relies on the unpaid labor of women and how the system realizes what many of us don't, but we're beginning to realize that why does this unpaid work keep getting done? How come the care economy keeps happening when it is so treated badly, if you like? Is because you care about those whom you care for. Mm-hmm. So you cannot withdraw it. Now, when you can't withdraw something, what does that mean? You can't go on strike. That's the ultimate weapon of the worker, right? That you don't have. So you lose all your bargaining power, and that's what enables that continued exploitation. I could go on, but I won't. So I will stop at this point and come back to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So let's, I was going to focus on home, so home, work, law. And Ayesha, of course, iconoclastic and idiosyncratic as ever. We had decided on an order. I will start with home, etc. She just said Jayati, and that's it. So we are going now in the opposite direction. Thank you for that. Okay, so when you think of home, so let's start with the most lovely idea of home. Or what we imagine when we use the word home, which is basically something like this: a space in which we share ideas, in which you can expect people to be there for you in a crisis. All of us in this room form nests and nests and nests of connections. When we fall ill, there are friends we can call upon. When we need money, there are people who lend us money. If there is a problem in your home, somebody will come and pick you up. If something happens on campus, you can turn. So this idea, this is a home. This can be a home. Now, it can be a home in many ways. It's a home for many of us, but there are people who feel alienated. We don't realize that there are people and sections who are feeling alienated. There are people who don't want us to feel at home and who would like to disrupt this idea of home. So there's an inside and outside. There's a ghore baire all the time when you think about home. So it's actually quite appropriate that one of the films will be ghore baire aaj, right? So when you start with the idea of home in this way, which is a group of multiple connections, networks of people who are there for one another and love one another in different ways, without rules. There are no rules the rules are only about care and respect and dignity. The rules are only about respecting one another, and the rules are also about being open to being criticized by people who don't feel part of your home. And so your answer is not meant to be defensive. No, we are not like that. No, we have to, in an ideal home of the sort that I'm imagining, we should be able, what's happening to this periodically? We should be able to stop, take stock, reassess our privilege, and so on, right? So starting with this idea of home, let's go to the actual home, the home inside, which is the home, which is the patriarchal heterosexual, based on the patriarchal heterosexual marriage, in which there is a very clear hierarchy of gender and age, and with gender trumping age. That is to say, the older sons the young sons will eventually have authority over the older mother, which is based on a very violent institution which we don't recognize as violent, which Jayati indicated, which is the sexual division of labor. It's violent because it constrains the lives of women to such an extent that if you walk into a classroom of 16-year-old boys and 12-year-old boys and 12-year-old girls, if you ask them what do you think you're going to be, the ambitions of those women those girls, those women are already restricted by what they know their life is going to be, which is limited by the heterosexual patriarchal marriage. And this sexual division of labor means that in certain, so it brings in the important thing about the sexual division, the idea of the sexual division of labor is that you can see class and caste operating there as well, because economically better off women can hire poor women to do the work. So it's the women hiring women because the work is not that of the man. And if the poorer woman doesn't come, the employer the woman has to take on that responsibility. And of course it means the poorer women, the women of lower caste, the way in which household work operates, which kind of workers are allowed into what spaces in the home. So there is that violent, and it's violent even when it is most loving. In fact, when it is very loving, also the violence is implicit, because there are rules about who you can love, what you can do, what is expected of you, and always, always, always the horizon of the compulsory heterosexual marriage which awaits you. So that is the home in the inside. And the home in the world would be, let's say, a hostel, where you come out of that home, you come into the hostel. Now, is the hostel private or public? is the hostels. And what happens is women's hostels in particular continually reproduce family norms, and they function like the most efficient family, even more so than your own family, because ultimately in your own family it is possible you can throw a tantrum and make your father let you do something. But in a hostel there are rules, and the rules involve your being home at 6, etc. So you will notice something very interesting. In the current regime, in the past 4 or 5 or 6 years, university authorities are constantly contacting parents for disciplinary action all over the country. Students protest, they call the parents. And fortunately, many parents say, but they're adults, they're doing what they do. Why are you calling us? Right? Fortunately, there are some parents who do that. But I know right now in Delhi University, right now, over the screening of the BBC documentary, the inquiry committee that has been set up to inquire into the screening of a documentary, which is widely available, as we know, is going to call parents as well. I'm going to inquire into and tell them what's wrong. So this replication of the patriarchal home in the home outside, which is the hostel, is something we need to think about. And I just want to end this part with this very lovely way in which one of our research scholars from our center, Avantika Tiwari, in her MPhil dissertation, talked about women's hostels as being a threshold. And that's an interesting space, right? Because it's neither public nor private, both public and private. I mean, we could think more about that.
So to take off a bit from where Nivi left, actually it's interesting to follow on from there, because she mentioned about the public and the private. In law, there was a very, very clear distinction and demarcation made what is the law operates in the public sphere and not in the private sphere. And actually it's the feminist jurists and jurisprudence has actually breached that, and particularly criminal law. I mean, there's always been personal law in the private sphere, but in terms of criminal law entering into the private sphere, which one former Delhi High Court judge very famously described as, it's like a bull in a china shop, because you have laws which are preventing violence within the family, within the marriage, within the home. And we know that now there are a slew of such laws, whether you have them relating to matrimonial home in the Indian Penal Code 498A, 304B, dowry-related cruelty, death, or you have the domestic violence law. So that breach which law had to make, which otherwise law is not supposed to enter that place. Since India did inherit the Indian Penal Code from a colonial system where the home had a lord and master, etc., that conceptualization and that imagination continued in the criminal law, and it has actually been largely women's movements interventions which created or conceptualized the woman. I think and while we see the woman now clearly in different aspects of the criminal law and the criminal justice system, it's not as though there's been an overall change. And since the time of Professor Lautika Sarkar, for instance, there's been this ongoing conversation about engendering the law. For instance, throughout criminal law, there is a doctrine that is used, which is a legal standard that is used, which is called the reasonable man. Because how does a judge assess whether the conduct of, say, the accused, if the accused behaved in X ways or accused behaves in Y way, how does the court assess whether this could or could not happen? It's through a doctrine which is used globally, called the doctrine of the reasonable man. And people like Dr. Lautika Sarkar, one of the early feminist law teachers we've had, raised the question but what about the reasonable woman? And is there a reasonable woman in the criminal justice system? And how do you address it? And one area where we run into that even today, and where courts are totally bewildered, is that, for instance, to take one example, is how does a rape survivor react, respond, behave, conduct herself post a sexual assault? It is beyond the comprehension and imagination of most judges. and therefore they fall back on stereotypes, rape myths, Bollywood masala, etc., and keep trying to impose them. So the criminal justice system actually did not conceptualize a woman to enter, and when it did, it was largely through the intervention, as I said, of women's movements asking for changes and reforms in the law, where she was then seen as a victim. But then the victim also had to conduct herself in certain ways. She was not seen as a person who is entering the legal space. Presently, I think because of a lot of conversation that has happened, and most of it has not been conducted by lawyers, thankfully, there is a decisive push to reimagine and to revisit this. So stereotypes, etc. You have a judgment of the Supreme Court by Justice Ravindra Bhatt, who has challenged and has actually written down commandments for judges what not to look for and what kind of stereotypes to avoid, because they're playing themselves out repeatedly in courts. I think Ayesha is getting a little anxious with time, but when one looks at just two more points I want to point out to. So when I began practice in 1989 in the trial courts, there were perhaps 5 women criminal lawyers in this city. So you can imagine what was happening. I'm talking about criminal lawyers, not in other branches of law. There would be more even then. The fact that today there are many more, the fact that they interface with judges, with other lawyers, does lead to a huge change. And one can see that manifest itself. It's not as though things have improved or things have improved, but they've not necessarily changed. And it is a process that one is part of. But if one was to look at the criminal law and the criminal justice system as a concept, as a philosophy, any feminist understanding would collide with it. The criminal law and the criminal justice system is premised fundamentally on power of the state. And it is about the state then regulating, controlling, for instance, deciding what is an offense. While certain offenses have been codified, the huge change made in sexual laws post-Nirbhaya, in which many students included were from JNU were taking a leading role, Jayati drew our attention to sexual exploitation, etc., within the home and the family and the labor, which is not recognized in economic terms. It's not recognized in law also. Not paying minimum wages is not a crime. Nobody goes to jail. You can't lodge an FIR if somebody doesn't pay you minimum wages. You can lodge FIRs for damage to property, but you can't lodge an FIR for no minimum wage. So the conceptualization of criminal law, where the state actually has to be in control, whether for sedition, etc., is to my mind something that feminists have not begun to explore or push the boundaries of. So you see women's rights intervention, but a feminist intervention would have to reimagine the criminal justice system very differently.